cast your mind back to Christmas 2022, because that's when this journey started for me in its current form. At that point in time, I was reminiscing about being back at university as a younger man when I was between 18 and 21 years old. And at that point in my life, I wasn't addicted to screens at all. I had a phone, but I wasn't particularly bothered about using it all the time. I had a laptop and I had a PC, but again, I used them for university work and not that much else, maybe watching a film every now and again. But as soon as I was done with them, I would just put them away and I would get on with my life. I'd meet up with other people, I would go running, I would go to the gym. I would basically spend a lot of my life away from phones. And one thing that was particularly useful for me at that point in time in my life was I wanted to get into reading more of the classics or more like Gothic literature specifically at the time, because it was just something which just piqued my interest for whatever reason. And I found that my attention span was great. I could sit down and I could read for 3, 4, 5 hours and I wouldn't think anything of it, have something to eat and then go straight back to it. And I basically spent full university summers just reading, really, or at the very least away from screens. And with this story starting in December of 2022, I found myself reminiscing about that because I had so many books on my bookshelf, but I could barely read for 10 minutes, 15 minutes at best. And my attention span just wasn't there. It wasn't relevant. It was just me being distracted in every possible way and in every possible area. And I made a decision at that point in time to become a reader again, to be able to basically go back to where I used to be. Maybe not to the extent of reading for that amount of time, but just learning how to just slow down and try to actually get a grip of this screen time before I go into my 30s, 40s, and 50s addicted to technology. And that was a lot easier said than done. I didn't realize at that point in time this would become a full library building project. I didn't realize at that point in time I would have actually then ended up reading 100 books on psychology and philosophy in a 2-year period. Because at that point in time, I struggled to read a book at all. It took me, I was looking at the data that I've collected with all this, it took me 4 months to read the first 5 books. And I barely remember anything about those books either. My memory isn't there, my retention wasn't there, but more specifically, I had this inner voice in my head just saying to me all the time, what's the point? Why are we doing this? You don't enjoy it, you're not going to be able to remember anything from this anyway, so there's no point learning about it. And even if you do learn something, you're not going to remember all of it. And what really occurred to me was I was paying too much attention to that voice. And that's exactly where the first book on this series comes in. It's called Embracing Your Inner Critic by Hal Stone and Sidra Stone. This was book number 44 on my list. I really wish I'd have read this as number 1 because it would have made the journey a lot easier. I'd have saved at least a year of my life in terms of reading and in terms of this project overall if I'd just paid attention to this at the very start. So that's why I'm starting this series with this book, because if you're someone who has that voice that's going in the back of your head all the time saying, do this or don't do that, or specifically don't do this because what will people think of you, or you'll never do it perfect, so why even start, then that is just your inner critic speaking to you. Now, it's worth reminding yourself, especially from the first few pages of this book, about what the inner critic is there to do. And it's there for 2 reasons. It's to spur you from feeling shame and to spur you from feeling pain. Those are 2 key things that you need to keep in mind as you are reading this. Because think about how many times you've started to do something but then backed away for one of those 2 reasons. Either it will be painful to start doing something, like start a new hobby, or it would be shameful if you started to do that instead. These were both very, very relevant for me as I started this process. It was try to spare me the pain of sitting down and trying to focus on something which I knew I would struggle to focus on. And it would also spare me the shame of, if I then said to somebody that actually I'd read a book and they asked me about it and I couldn't really tell them very much about it at all, it would spare me the shame of thinking that I'm better than I actually am, or that I'm more educated than I actually am, or whatever else it might be. It would basically mean that it would just funnel me away from those 2 areas and just live a comfortable life overall. It wouldn't be a bad life, but it would be a narrower life. It would be a life not to the full extent that I would want to live it. And I would have to embrace that pain and embrace that shame as a part of the process if I was going to overcome this. And that's why this isn't called banishing the inner critic. It's not called getting rid of the inner critic. It's embracing it. It's learning to understand where that voice came from, and that actually, in its own twisted way, it's trying to help you. It's trying to say, look, I know that you're feeling vulnerable at this point in time, starting this new job, starting this new relationship, starting this new hobby, thinking about yourself in a different way. But just because you've got those feelings, it doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. Just because you've got doubts about the process doesn't mean that you should stop the process altogether. It means that instead of just listening to that inner critic, what could be useful is understanding where that voice came from and then understanding what we can do about it. And that's what's absolutely amazing about this book. It's filled with not just the minimum bit of theory that you're going to actually need to be able to make sense of all this, but also it gives you very, very practical questions to help you actually understand your inner critic. So I'm just going to quote a few questions from page 23 on this. As you can probably see on here, I've quite heavily highlighted this book as well because there's so much gold in it over and over and over again. But just listen to a couple of these questions and see what resonates with you, and maybe make a little note of any thoughts that first come to mind as you are thinking about this and as you're hearing this. First of all, when you are thinking about your inner critic, what is that inner critic saying to you? So let's say you're at this point in time trying to apply for a new job or whatever else it might be in your life that's particularly relevant at this point in time. Like, what is actually stopping you from doing that thing? What's that inner critic? What's that inner voice, that inner monologue saying to you at this point in time and saying why you shouldn't do it? If you like, you can pause the video now and just make a note of maybe 3, 4, 5 different phrases that you might hear. I shared some of mine before around this library building project, which was around the idea of, who are you to think that you can concentrate for this long? What's the point of doing this anyway? Even if people ask you about it, you're not going to be able to remember it all. You're never going to remember every single word in every single book. That's the inner critic. It's saying, what's the point of doing this? It's saying, to avoid pain and shame later on, here are some thoughts to help you basically move away from it. So write down just any thoughts that you've got at this point in time, whatever your inner critic is saying to you, and just be aware of a couple of these questions. Like I say, these are from page 23. If you decide to buy this book, there's so many questions like this. So first of all, looking at the statements that you might have written down or you might just be thinking about at this stage. First of all, does this statement sound like somebody that I know? That's a huge question in and of itself. Is this your voice, or is this the voice of somebody else that you either know or used to know in your life? Part 2 to that question. When do I first remember being concerned about this issue? Again, this might be quite a difficult question, might be quite a confronting question. Could be a question around self-esteem at this point in time. If you're looking at trying to apply for a new job or to be able to get a raise in the current job, it might be a question of, who do you think you are to be able to ask for this type of money? Like, that could be the question that if we go back into our life, when did we first become concerned about the fact that maybe we should lower our expectations of ourselves? So some of these questions go a little bit further back than maybe just the current present moment, because we are trying to understand where this inner critic came from as well. So does this statement sound like somebody that I know? Is it maybe the voice of your mum or your dad? Is it a close friend? Is it an authority figure from your life growing up? And when do I first remember being concerned about this issue? Roughly what age were you? Is it a more recent thing, or is it going all the way back to childhood? And again, if we were to take this on a wider scope, I've mentioned there this idea of a parental figure or an authority figure. We can take it a little bit further than that still. Write down your mother's favourite judgmental comments about you. And if she did not say these out loud, what was it about you that you knew displeased her? Again, it's a huge, huge question. It's being aware of where these judgments came from. It's where they originated. It doesn't matter that they're here now and that they're relevant now. It's worth going back in time to realising why those actually still have a hold of us. Why they are an inner critic voice and not just another voice that just comes and goes like everything else that we hear. So write down, it might not be your mother's, it might be father's, it might be best friends, it might be old boss. You can choose these terms however way you like, but write down your mother's favourite judgmental comments about you, and if she did not say these out loud, what was it about you that you knew displeased her? And we can take this a little bit further in terms of moving away from yourself and moving towards others. But think of the ways in which your mother judged other people. Write down some of her favourite judgments about others. And that's just a small selection of questions there. That's 4 questions. There must be 50 or 60 similar ones in this book. And as we're looking at this, as we're looking at the purpose of embracing your inner critic, we're not just understanding where it came from and what it's saying. We are learning that embrace. We're learning to take that as a part of our story as well. And that's been absolutely huge for me. It's made me really clear about what it is that I'm trying to do and what it is that I'm trying to build. I'm not building a library so that I can memorize every single word in every single book. It's so that I can get the key concepts from the key books that I can then use to teach and apply to other people, as well as doing this work on myself. So in that situation, I'm moving away from this perfectionism, and I'm embracing the fact that some people might ask me questions, and it might bring me a certain amount of shame that I might not actually have the answers to it. There might be a certain amount of pain that I feel in the sense that I know that I want to become more than I currently am, and I'm not quite there yet. But in both cases, it's okay to feel that pain. It's okay to feel that shame. It's just making sure that I'm moving towards a life that I actually want to live, rather than being more focused on like a deficiency, more focused on just playing it safe all the time. And with a lot of these books in this series, these aren't just standalone books, they all link together brilliantly. There's so many themes that cross over. As you'll start to see, if you were to watch this playlist once and then to watch it again after listening to every single book and every single book recommendation, you'll start to realise, oh, actually, this links to this and this links to this. And it's exactly the same as you start to notice what your inner critic is doing. You realise it's saying the same thing in your relationships, at work, when you're at home on your own, when you're out in nature. Maybe when you're raising a family in the future, if you haven't got one currently. Like, the inner critic is in your head. It's an internalized set of rules and principles, again, based on this idea of avoiding pain and avoiding shame. It doesn't care that we're just focusing on work. It doesn't care that we're just focused on relationships. These are going to be blanket statements that colour and cloudy everything. So the sooner we get an idea about what it is that it's saying, then the sooner it is that we can actually start to welcome it and start to accept it. And that's going to be particularly useful when we move on to the second book in this series, which is going to be the next one along on here, where we can start to understand our vulnerability and realising not just the vulnerability that we're feeling and allowing and accepting, but also realising what is it that we're looking at in other people and maybe putting them on a bit of a pedestal and realising there's a reason that they've got those traits and there's a reason why I idolise those traits. Maybe I can learn to see them in myself, but to be able to do that, we need to make sure we've embraced our inner critic. We need to make sure that is on board. This is absolutely the number one book that I would suggest starting all of this with, just because it's got such simple, easy language. It's not very long. There's questionnaires in here as well. There's full of journal questions if you like that approach. But embrace your inner critic, and this journey is going to be so much easier. That is book number 1 in this series.